This is the Ohio Farm Bureau podcast in Washington, D.C. this week for the county president's trip. Joining us is Bill Patterson, president of Ohio Farm Bureau. We have raided the American Farm Bureau TV studios here, so this is where Farm Bureau does some TV work as well as RFD TV and AgriPulse, and we are here because President Patterson was just on RFD TV talking about this trip, and always a great experience to bring county leaders from all over the state to D.C. to talk with lawmakers about issues that are important to agriculture in Ohio and across the country. One of the biggest conversation pieces this week is the Farm Bill. What are we telling members of Congress about this important piece of legislation that hopefully we'll get through later on this year?
Yeah, it really is. Every 5 years it becomes, a really big deal. It's something that we, rely on. It's something that the country relies on to make sure that there's a safe and affordable supply of food. And we just want to make sure that, we have a decent farm bill in place right now, but we know there's some areas that we can improve. We know that we want to make sure that we maintain funding for the Department of Agriculture. We want to make sure that some of the programs that we have now remain in place, but also remain flexible to make sure that they're really providing the purpose. And again, that's a safe and affordable food supply.
What's your advice to these leaders as they come to Washington? Some for the first time, might be a little nervous getting in front of lawmakers face to face, but how do you go about telling them to get their message across?
Yeah, I mean, we continue to talk about, and this comes from the legislators to us. We continue to talk about just telling your story. We want to make sure, but what is so important and what the role of Ohio Farm Bureau is, the staff at Ohio Farm Bureau, is to make sure that we're prepared, and so they understand how their story is relevant to the current issues. And so just giving the tools on top of the story, which is what they're looking for in order to be effective advocates. And so it's really exciting when you see the two come together and they're able to provide those stories, that when that legislator is placing his vote or making his vote, whether it's an action on the farm bill or wherever it is, that they can put that face of that farmer to the action that they're taking on the floor.
This also speaks to the accessibility that Ohio Farm Bureau gives our members to get right in front of legislators to talk about important issues. It's all part of being a member.
Yeah, that's, I was talking today when I had an opportunity to talk to the presidents. I was talking about some of the most important things I think that Ohio Farm Bureau does, and the list is fairly simple. Everything that involves the grassroots operations of Ohio Farm Bureau and the County Farm Bureau is the most important, whether it's in the county meeting, whether it's these visits, whether it's the state annual meeting or the youth leadership conference. It's really talking about the grassroots involvement in the organization. And if we have the grassroots at the forefront of the organization, we are absolutely going to be successful.
We're going to the lawmakers, but the lawmakers also coming to us. Senator Sherrod Brown is going to be visiting with us a little bit later on during the podcast, and also Senator Vance, J.D. Vance, very new to the position representing Ohio, and he'll be talking with our members from across the state as well here on the county president's trip in D.C. A little bit of an extra for those watching the video online. We were commenting on this picture behind us here. It's the state capitol, or the nation's capital, in the middle of a bean field, and I told President Patterson that's how it looked when the founding fathers came over, and first thing they did was put the Capitol building up, and then they had to take care of everything else around it. But really shows the importance of agriculture here in D.C. We're here in full force with Ohio Farm Bureau. Other state farm bureaus also here at the same time, flying in to talk about very important issues affecting our members across the state and across the country. Back with more of the Ohio Farm Bureau podcast after this.
Find out how Nationwide Agribusiness can help you grow your business. Get to know the people with the experience and knowledge to help you. Whether you are looking to protect your farm or ranch from the ground up, or need someone who understands your changing commercial ag needs. Find out how to better manage the risks of your ag business, or how quickly you can get back to business. Learn how you can protect your next with Nationwide on your side.
Welcome back to the Ohio Farm Bureau podcast. County Farm Bureau leaders from across Ohio were in D.C. earlier this month. Had a chance to hear from both senators. Always a unique opportunity to be face-to-face with our senators and lawmakers in Washington to talk about those important issues to Ohio agriculture. J.D. Vance visited with our member leaders for the first time as he was just elected last year.
Thanks to all my friends at the Ohio Farm Bureau for helping out during the campaign in ways big and small, and most importantly, now that we're here, actually making sure that we do things the right way, and we constantly have a connection to the agricultural community in Ohio. It's very important to me. I know it's very important to the economy in Ohio. You're just talking just on the elevator on the way up here. My ag guy, the guy we hired to sort of do agricultural policy in our office, is from Fresno, California, which, first blush you would think is as different from Middletown, Ohio, or different from agricultural Ohio as imaginable. And yet, because of how much California farm policy is this weird mixture between big farms, very successful agriculture, but also these massive cities and the interplay between the two, there's actually a lot of similarities between California agriculture and Ohio agriculture, and Brian is a great guy. I think all of you will get a chance to know him. I will say Ohio, I always joke, my wife is from Southern California, and I always joke that the difference between Ohio agriculture and California agriculture is it actually rains in Ohio. Things were meant to grow in Ohio. So we have that advantage and that difference, but there are some similarities there, and I think Brian brings a lot of great experience to this issue, and I hope you will see him as a resource, because we certainly see all of you as a resource on agricultural policy. Let me just say a few things and about how sort of I think about what all of you are doing and how we can protect and defend our farmers here over the next couple of years. And then if it's okay, I'll take a few questions if that's all right. I don't want to just talk at you. It's always more interesting to have a conversation here. So I know Senator Brown, my colleague, and my the chair of the banking committee, and one of the few purple state, blue and red pairs still left in the United States Senate. I know he was here yesterday. I know we're working on a railway safety bill together. I appreciate his work on that, and I appreciate him coming here and speaking to the Ohio Farm Bureau. I think way too many Democrats probably assume that there are no Democrats among farmers, which I know that's not true. So I appreciate him coming and actually giving you guys some time and making sure that the agricultural committee or agricultural issues matter to both of Ohio's senators. The way that I think about this is in a couple of different ways. So there are ways in which the bad policies coming from Washington right now affect everybody, but they affect the agricultural community very particularly. So one of the things that I was really affected by when I went around during the campaign and met a lot of farmers and spent a lot of time with farm communities is the price increases that everybody sees at the grocery store. You guys see up front, and you see it in much, much bigger and more significant ways. I'm worried about the natural gas prices that Ohio consumers are paying to heat their homes, but of course, because so much of the fertilizer that our farmers use are derived from natural gas, when we have an administration that's waging war on American energy, what you also have is skyrocketing prices for farmers, not just in the obvious things, but in some of the less obvious things like fertilizer. We have to do better on that. We have to bring energy prices down. It's ridiculous. I guess you're paying a little bit less today than you were a year ago for diesel fuel, thank God, but not that much less. And it's still way, way too much. We're paying way too much for fertilizer, and we have to have self-sufficiency in our communities. Here's why I care so much about farming. Obviously, I care about its regional effects on the Ohio economy. I care about all the people whose jobs depend on farming. But one of the big mistakes that we made in this country over the last 40 years is we stopped making our own stuff and we stopped being self-sufficient. We see this in the manufacturing economy more than anywhere, and we're now paying the consequences for it in ways big and small. Let me tell you just something I learned a couple of days ago. We got to interview the chairman of the Federal Reserve. He has to come before the banking committee twice a year and answer our questions. And so I was doing some research then. Obviously, we have a big war going on in Europe right now between Russia and Ukraine. Russia committed this illegal invasion. And look, different people come down on that war and how the United States should respond to it in different ways. I don't want to pontificate on that here. What was crazy to me, though, is I was looking. Russia has 1/10 the economy of the United States. Its economy is 1/10 the size of the United States. The Russians are firing 20,000 artillery shells a day in Ukraine as part of that war. The United States is ramping up our manufacturing of artillery from 14,000 to 20,000 shells a month, right? God forbid a war came to our soil and we have an economy that's 1/10 the size of ours that only makes, that makes in a day what we can make in a year. Well, that very thing could happen to our food economy if we don't make better decisions for our farmers and for our agriculture community. I care a lot about manufactured goods. I care a lot about energy. You cannot run a civilization without food. It's the most important thing, and we have pursued largely bipartisan, I will say, to give credit to my friends on the other side of the aisle, largely bipartisan set of policies to ensure that we are a self-sufficient food economy in the United States of America. I want to keep it that way. I want to be committed to that. Let me sort of say one final thing here, and then I'll shut up and I'll take a few questions. I really believe that there is something special about our rural communities in the state of Ohio. If you look at some of the things, for example, that make kids successful, growing up in stable families, having a strong connection to their grandparents, to their aunts and uncles, to their extended family. I think you know this better than anybody, but I certainly know this, that some of our rural communities have great values, and they produce communities where kids thrive, whether they decide to go to college, whether they decide to grow up on the farm and invest in the farm, whether they come back to rural America, or whether they decide to go to the cities. We have special places, special agricultural communities in the state of Ohio that I want to preserve and I want to fight for. So it's not just about the economy, it's not just about the self-sufficiency, it's not just about the jobs. I think you guys represent a community that has a very special impact in values, in morality in our state, and I just want to point that out and recognize that. It's one of the reasons why I see myself as an advocate for what you guys are all doing, is because we don't want our rural communities in the state of Ohio to disappear. There are a lot of good things happening in the state of Ohio. I think Governor DeWine, Lieutenant Governor Houston, you guys all know them, deserve a lot of credit for this. But we have to make sure that as we develop and as we bring a lot of economic innovation to the state of Ohio, which is a great thing, we have to make sure we preserve the rural culture that exists in our state as well. And I think it's going to be a tough thing for us to balance in the next 20 years. It's a good problem to have, right? You'd rather have development than not have development, but it is something for us to manage, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue with all of you on those issues, on everything else. But happy to take some questions. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be here with you.
One of the first questions was about farmland preservation. Senator Vance was asked by a Farm Bureau member in Butler County how to balance farmland preservation with the industry we're seeing pop up all over Ohio.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, and like many good questions, I don't know that I have a great answer to it, because I understand Butler County as well as anybody. I mean, when I grew up, I remember I went to Roosevelt Elementary School in Middletown, Ohio, and I had friends whose parents and grandparents lived on farms in Monroe or in West Middletown. You go to Monroe now, and it's development, it's commercial buildings, it's new homes. It's actually shocking how rural Middletown felt when I was a 12-year-old kid versus how Middletown feels. I'm only 38 years old, 25, 26 years later. One thing I'd propose is I'd love to hear ideas for how to preserve this stuff, because I don't know everything. My staff doesn't know everything. But what I can promise is that you guys will always have an open link to Brian and to other people on the staff, and of course to me personally. So if there are ways of working together, maybe there are things that we could do with taxes. Maybe there are things that we could do that could actually make it a little bit easier for the farmers to keep their land if they want to. Obviously, some of this is not just the economic incentives, the fact that home prices are so high in Butler County. A lot of it's also the family dynamics, of course, right? Which I don't know that, I assume that there are ways to help with public policy, but I don't have all the answers here, because I talked to a number of families where maybe in the 1960s there were 5 kids, and now in the 1990s there were 3 kids, and now there's 2 kids or 1 kid, and that 1 kid just doesn't want to farm. So I think a lot of it is also trying to think about how we involve the families in the business a little bit. But it's a good question. I don't know the full answer, but I'm open to ideas and I'm open to suggestions, because I've thought about this a lot in the context of Knox County, where you're going to have the new Intel facility developed and built over the next decade. Knox County is beautiful farmland, and we've been talking a lot with some of the folks in the Chamber of Commerce, the agricultural community there, about what you would do to sort of, I remember I had a roundtable during the campaign, which was really supposed to be about the Intel facility, and ended up being about how do we preserve the rural nature of this county, and that was in Knox County. And I think, I don't have all the answers, but I'm certainly open to talking about it and figuring out ways to preserve the rural character of our state.
He was also asked about waters of the U.S., something that the Biden administration brought back through its EPA, and something that lawmakers in Washington are hoping to reverse again.
Yeah, I've actually, I saw this a little bit in my business life, where we had a company that was building a facility, and they basically had to get sign off from the EPA that a cow pond that a guy, a cattle farmer had dug out with a backhoe. He had to get certification that this did not qualify as the waters of the United States, so that they would, so that something they were doing 5 miles away wouldn't have a delayed construction project. It almost cost the company millions of dollars to have to delay the construction project. So look, I agree. I mean, look, we all believe in reasonable regulation to protect health and safety. We all believe in clean air and clean water, but this stuff has really gotten out of control. And to me, it's a very basic question. Are you regulating to harm business, or are you regulating to protect public safety? And I think that a lot of the waters of the United States stuff has clearly crossed into there's no obvious public safety benefit. They're just doing stuff that's going to harm business. And that's my view on it. I certainly oppose it. I will say, normally in a town like this where you have, Chuck Schumer is, the majority leader at 51, Mitch McConnell's the minority leader at 49, and of course Kevin McCarthy controls the House. Normally you wouldn't have a whole lot get done. We have had a couple of interesting things move through that are pretty good from my perspective as a conservative. Number one, last night we got a bill passed that effectively overruled some of the crazy soft on crime stuff that the DC city government is doing. We also, last week, I believe, maybe the week before, we got a Biden administration regulation overruled that would actually have forced a lot of the ESG stuff, the environmental sustainability, or environmental social governance is what it stands for. But it's basically a way for the Biden administration to inject politics into the market economy. And I think he'll veto this, but we at least got that passed out of both the House and the Senate, overruling some of the regulations they put in place there. So there's maybe on this waters of the United States stuff, there's maybe something we could do here to try to overrule some of the Biden administration regulation. Maybe he vetoes it, but it's at least worth a shot. So I'd ask you guys maybe to follow up with Brian on that, because I don't know if anybody's working on it. If they are, we'll sign on to it. If nobody's working on it yet, that might be something that we could take up.
And of course, you got a question about the 2023 Farm Bill, one of the most important pieces of legislation going through Congress, hopefully later on this year.
Generally supportive. Obviously, there are different pieces of it that I like, pieces of it that I maybe am not as big of a fan of. But I'm not one of these guys who's going to stand here and say that, like Mike Lee. I love Mike Lee. He's one of my best friends in the United States Senate. Mike Lee hates all of the ethanol-related stuff in the Farm Bill. Okay. And I understand where he's coming from. I understand the principle that he's applying to, but there's a certain level where you have to represent the interests of your state. That's what you're doing here. And I think there are a lot of pieces of the Farm Bill that are important for the state of Ohio. And my basic view here is my role is, to the extent that I can, to fight for the provisions that are good for the state of Ohio. So I look at it in a very pragmatic way, and that's how I'll approach it. And I think that we'll see what form it takes, but I suspect that we're going to get a halfway decent Farm Bill. I believe it's up in 23, right? So it'll be this year where it goes through all the cycles.
Senator J.D. Vance visiting with County Farm Bureau leaders across Ohio in Washington, D.C. earlier this month on our county president's trip. We also heard from Senator Sherrod Brown, his thoughts coming up after this on the Ohio Farm Bureau podcast. Welcome back to the Ohio Farm Bureau podcast. I'm Ty Higgins. Time to hear from Senator Sherrod Brown as he visited with County Farm Bureau leaders from across Ohio at our D.C. trip earlier this month.
I want to start with a few words about East Palestine. I was talking to John Grafton, where John goes. John's over there. Who lives in the county just south of Columbiana County. And Columbiana County is a county, believe it or not, some of you that are from Eastern Ohio may know this. As recently as 30, maybe 35 years ago, Columbiana County that county alone produced 80% of the dishware, of the ceramics that you're eating from. 80 to 85% of the dishware for the whole country was made in that county. And one of my number of times I went there, I was talking to the sheriff, and he was just saying I knew it was gone, mostly because of, I think, bad trade agreements and outsourcing of jobs and all that. And he said the last pottery, and they were everywhere in the county, East Palestine and Lisbon and Salem and Liverpool and all over. He said the last one closed 2 or 3 years ago. Last pottery shut down. And that's the story. I mean, you make Ohio agriculture and Ohio communities prosperous by the work you do. But I grew up in Mansfield. I said I worked on a family farm. I didn't live on it. And I went to a school called Johnny Appleseed Junior High. It's a pretty cool name. And I went to school with the sons and daughters of rubber workers at Mansfield Tire and electrical workers at Westinghouse and auto workers at General Motors and electrical machinists at Mansfield at Tappan Stoves. And all of those companies are gone, and you know what that's done to the overall prosperity of the state. So, but let me talk for a moment about East Palestine, and I don't want to talk about obviously ag issues. I've talked with residents a number of times. I've been on the phone from pretty much day one, talking to residents, talking to officials, talking to the mayor, the sheriff, the fire chief, business owners. A woman named Melissa Smith, who I have gotten to know, runs a little candle company. She makes candles. I didn't know that she makes candles out of soy instead of wax. I didn't even know what that was, but my wife said, "You don't know what soy can anyway." So, but I mean, she's got this thriving business. She does a lot of online stuff. She hosted a meeting at her little company and just talked about all of these issues. The fire chief is paid. There are 20 volunteer firefighters, volunteers. Many of your communities have that kind of fire protection. Worked with Governor DeWine on some of these issues, and Governor DeWine's pretty outraged, rightly, and one of the bill we're working on will include this, that when these trains come into the state, they don't even have to tell anybody, the state, the local rescue squads, the firefighters, the hazmat firefighters, if they're already trained in that region, they don't even have to tell us they're in the state. So we are very ill-equipped to deal with something like that happened there, to have the hazmat workers and all that matters. So I'm working with Senator Vance. Senator Vance has been in office, I guess, 2 months. We were working on a bipartisan bill. He hears the same issues I do in East Palestine, that these trains, there have now been 5 derailments in the last 5 months. Sandusky, Steubenville, East Palestine, of course, Ravenna, and what just happened in the last week in Springfield. And what could have happened, the line that derailed in East Palestine went through Salem, a community a good bit bigger, and Ravenna, a community much bigger. And if that derailing had happened an hour earlier, it would have been multiples of 4 or 5 or 6 times the damage that had been done there. So Senator Vance and I have come together, surprised some people. He and I don't exactly look at the world together the same, but I wanted to continue, and so does he so far, continue the tradition that Senator Portman and I, and really before us, established in getting things done for the state bipartisan, whether it's the bridge over the Ohio River, whether it's the infrastructure bill for all the little bridges that I drive farm wagons over, the little culvert bridges that really matter if you don't have to go 4 miles out of the way to go over a creek, all the kinds of things we did there. On opioids, we worked together on the PACT Act, which serves veterans, those veterans that were exposed to those football field-sized burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan. They come home, and 6 years later they develop a bronchial illness or a cancer. And we passed that law that I wrote with the chair and the ranking member of the Veterans Committee to make sure that if they have any veteran over the next 10 years, has any or longer, has any one of those 23 illnesses, they immediately get care at the VA. I want to figure out how we make sure that anybody exposed in East Palestine to those chemicals, and we don't know yet what that means. And one other story real quick about East Palestine. I was talking to a woman whose husband, and she and her husband have about 20 beef cattle. It's not the only way they make a living, as you would guess, but they've sold half sides of beef to friends and neighbors for years, and they're now getting calls from those friends and neighbors saying, "I'm not sure I want to buy your beef this year," because how do we know? We just don't know what the contamination and what that means. So Norfolk Southern, which is a company that's laid off 1/3 of its workers in the last 10 years. Its executives, its CEO, have done stock buybacks to the tune of $3 billion as it's laid off workers. Simply is not investing enough in safety. And the Brown-Vance bill will essentially say to them, you're going to disclose when you come into the state, you're going to fix your wheel bearings and test them and the heat monitors along the tracks. You're going to Norfolk Southern wants to drive these trains with one person, one human being in the train. They're going to have at least a crew of 2. These trains now, as you've seen, and I know it drives you crazy sometimes, the East Palestine train was 150 cars. The Springfield train was 220 cars. And there is, and you know what that does to slowing things down and the profits, but it's more profit for the company. And I want Norfolk Southern to make a good profit, but they don't need to do the stock buybacks, and they don't need to keep cutting on safety like they have. So Senator Vance and I are testifying in committee tomorrow with the CEO of Norfolk Southern also there, and they've got to answer some real questions. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of fill you in there because it's all over the news, of course. You know the numbers: 1 in 7 Ohioans depend on agriculture in some form of some part of their job. That plus just my interest in ag. I joined the Ag Committee my first year in the Senate in 2007. I was the first senator since the 1950s, I believe, from Ohio that was on the Ag Committee. As important as ag is to our state, you know, not enough people think of us as an ag state. They think of us as an industrial state, or they think of us as a healthcare state, but we clearly are an ag state. In addition to those, and my being on that committee speaks to that. This is the we do a farm bill every 5 years. This is the 4th farm bill that we've done since I've been in the Senate under Republican chairs and Democratic chairs. And you really can't tell that when doing 2 committees, I serve on agriculture and veterans. You really can't tell who the Republican, who the Democrat is by the product we put out. It usually passes by big margins. Last year it was 87-13. I don't even remember who the 13 were, but they were. I think none of them were on the Ag Committee, and none of them had a very good understanding of what this bill is all about. But the real divisions on the Agriculture Committee are more regional than they are partisan. So you can guess Southern farmers look at the world differently from Midwest farmers. That's why I team up consistently with 2 Republicans who are Midwestern. They're not quite Midwestern like we are, but from South Dakota, John Thune, who's the #2 ranked, right below McConnell, Republican in the Senate, and Chuck Grassley, who's been there since like the Spanish-American War. Grassley, who's been in the Senate since, I don't know, 1980 or 70, and is just reelected at the age of, I'm not engaging him, but he's been a long time. He and I have teamed up, and he's from Iowa, so obviously those are important farm states. The chair of the committee is Debbie Stabenow. She has announced her retirement. She's from Michigan, so I think she will put special emphasis this year because it's her last year. I have done, as we've done the farm bill every year, the year leading up to the enactment. I do it, and Bill's helped with this. Others have, many of you have helped with this over the years, Adam and others. I do roundtables in different parts of the state. I remember in Southern Ohio, I did specialty crops. In Northwest Ohio, I did grain farmers. And Northeast Ohio, cattle and dairy. Did one at Ohio State every year to kind of get their perspective. And I sit around a table with, 2 tables like this size, maybe 15 people, usually active farmers, sometimes others in the community that care about farming. And I just listen for ideas. I don't talk much. It's not one of those town hall meetings when everybody yells at each other about guns and abortion. It's about getting something done and listening to your ideas. And in Corbin, I've done them at Bill's Farm and many others. We try to incorporate those ideas into legislation. We usually hold one at Worcester too, because of that research station, and they've been helpful too. So I will be this year doing the same as we're working on this. So let me talk a little bit about the farm bill before. We strengthened the safety net in 2018. We defended crop insurance, improved the average risk coverage program, and that was with Senator Thune of the Republican of South Dakota I mentioned. We worked on creating the ARC program in the 2014 Farm Bill, and then learned from its operation and repassed it, improved it, and improved conservation programs in 2018. We got an amendment bill to the bill to increase the cost share for EQIP. That affects a number of you. We created a new CRP program, the Great Lakes Estuaries and Rivers program. That obviously matters, especially for those of you in Northwest Ohio and the Maumee River Basin. As you may know, the Maumee River Basin is the largest catchment area, covers the most acres of any any river that goes into any of the Great Lakes. And my favorite, this is way off the top, my favorite Lake Erie trivia point is this, that of all the Great Lakes, Lake Erie is the smallest and the shallowest. As you know, around Toledo, it's only 30 feet deep, so it's much more vulnerable to runoff and to just pollutants, industrial pollutants and agricultural runoff than the rest of the Great Lakes. But here's the interesting point. The Great Lakes, of all the water in the Great Lakes, Lake Erie is 2% of the water of all the Great Lakes, because Lake Superior is bigger surface area and so much deeper. 2% of the water, and Lake Erie has 50% of the fish. In Lake Superior is 50% of the water and 2% of the fish, because the fish are obviously want to be in shallow, warmer waters. And that just, that fact makes our work on Lake Erie especially important. And we have we're blessed with a lake, the greatest body of fresh water in the world, one of the Great Lakes, and the Ohio River, and what that means for our responsibilities to keep those clean in every way we can. Also, I wanted to mention briefly the Infrastructure Inflation Reduction Act. Technology and innovation in agriculture continues to advance. Auto steer tractors that rely on GPS infield monitoring, electric tractors, vehicles. Farming is, as you tell me often, and particularly if you're more or less my age, how farming's changed in the last 20, 30, 40 years, and how Ohio agriculture is some of the best in the country, is really good at adapting to that. And that's why we write a farm bill every 5 years. We need to modernize it and update it and listen to how all that works. The infrastructure bill that Senator Portman and I worked on, that means we're going to rebuild the Brent Spence Bridge in Cincinnati. That was Senator McConnell came out, President Biden came out, and we did an event there with Senator Portman right after he left office. And that bridge carries 3% of GDP over it every day. That's why that bridge is so important. But that was sort of the headliner of the infrastructure bill. There were a zillion other things that mattered, in small bridges, culvert bridges, whatever, investment in water and sewer systems, all the kinds of things. There also was a major investment in broadband, and for some of you, broadband still is still not available as it should be, especially in obviously more rural areas, especially in rural hilly areas, like a little better in Northwest Ohio than Southeast. But those investments should matter. And we want to make sure, as the law is rolled out, that Ohio gets at least its fair share, and I will be there advocating, so let me know there. In the Inflation Reduction Act, $40 billion in ag, forestry, and rural development investments. A young man, not all that young anymore, named John McCracken, who worked on ag for me from already the month after I took office in 2007. He's now at USDA, moved back to Columbus with his wife, started a family, wanted to go back home, and he is now working at USDA on economic development. He's helped us in East Palestine, and he will help us in other ways, and reach out to him if there's anything we can do. He's not on my staff, but he works for USDA, and we talk, and he and my staff. And Wes from my staff is Wes behind the pollers. But okay, Wes has the job that John McCracken had, so you should get to know Wes. The staff of Ohio Farm Bureau already knows him, but we'll continue to work with him. Through the Farm Bureau, we'll let you all know, and show up or send a family member or friend or anybody that wants to talk about what we need to do, because you know a whole lot more about agriculture than I do. You know more about your community and your farms, and I will learn. One of the most fun parts of this job is just learning from people and their daily work lives and their daily lives, and trying to translate some of that into doing the right thing here.
Senator Sherrod Brown talking with our County Farm Bureau leaders at our President's Trip in Washington, D.C. earlier this month. That'll do it for the Ohio Farm Bureau podcast. Make sure and log on to ohiofarmbureau.org to hear previous podcasts. If you like what you hear, make sure and like, subscribe, and follow wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, I'm Ty Higgins. Thanks for watching. We'll see you down the road.